time everyone, this is Kerjims channel. Now we are back to our new episodes of two similarity champions and comparison, featured by Wild League of Legends versus the Mobile Legends Bang Gang. But before that, please like and subscribe to my channel and don't forget to click the bell icon so you'll be notified to our new next episode. Let's do this!
Shurima used to be the most powerful empire of Runeterra, but one day it mysteriously vanished. As hinted in Talia's story, it has recently risen from the sand again. Today, we will reveal the story of both the downfall and the renewal of the Shuriman Empire. It all began thousands of years ago. Shurima was an empire that conquered the lands with powerful armies led by all but invincible warriors known as the Ascended. Their power was granted to them by a giant sun disk hovering above the capital city. Ruled by an ambitious and power-hungry emperor, Shurima was the greatest realm of its day. The youngest and least favorite son of the emperor, Azir, was never destined for greatness. With so many siblings ahead of him, he would never be an emperor. He spent most of his time in the great library of Nasus, studying history of Shurima, rather than training how to fight under the ascended hero called Renekton. While studying in the library, Azir got to know a slave boy who visited the library almost every day to collect books desired by his master. Slaves in Shurima were forbidden to take names, but as the two boys became friends, Azir broke that law and called his new friend Zera, which means one who shares. Azir appointed Zera as his personal slave, and the two boys started to learn all they could about Shurima's past and its long legacy of ascended heroes. Every year, the emperor went on a tour around his empire with his family. One night, the royal caravan stopped at a well-known oasis. While everyone was sleeping, Zera and Azir wandered away to draw stars. They wanted to add them into the collection in the Great Library. Unfortunately, while they were away, the royal caravan was attacked by assassins sent by the emperor's enemies. One of the assassins found the two boys out in the desert. He was about to cut Azir's throat when Zera intervened. He threw himself on the assassin's back and gave Azir time to pull out his dagger and shove it in the attacker's throat. Then they rushed back to the caravan, but by the time they returned, the assassins were already defeated. Renekton had protected the emperor and he had slain the attackers, but Azir's brothers were all dead. Azir told his father how Zera saved his life and he wanted to reward him for his courage. But in his father's eyes, a slave was just a slave, and so he ignored him. That day, Azir swore that one day he and Zera would be brothers. The emperor returned to his capital, where he began his campaign of bloodshed against those he believed had sent the assassin. For the next few years, the emperor was consumed by paranoia that led him to executing innocent. Although Azir was both the emperor's son and his heir, his life too hung by a thread. His father hated him, wishing he would have died instead of his brother, and the queen was still young enough to bear sons. The attack at the oasis showed Azir how weak he really was. Because of that, he started training under Renekton, and he learned how to use swords and spears, and even how to command his warriors. After some time, Azir elevated Zerath and made him his right hand. His task was to seek out knowledge wherever he could find it. Years passed, but the queen was never able to carry a child. Every conceived infant perished before it could even be born. Because of that, Azir's life was relatively safe. Some believed that the queen was cursed, and some even named Azir as somehow being connected with it. But Azir was proven innocent every time, and he executed those who dared to accuse him of this. Eventually, the queen bore a healthy son, but on the night of his birth, a terrible storm engulfed Shurima. The queen's chambers were struck again and again by a powerful bolt of lightning. That night, both the queen and her newborn son were killed. It was said that the emperor went mad with grief and he took his own life upon hearing the news. But tales soon spread of how he and his guards were found laying in pieces on the palace floor, their bodies little more than charred skeletons. Azir was shocked by their deaths, but the empire needed a leader, and with Zerath at his side, he took control of Shurima and its emperor. Over the next decade, he expanded Shurima's border and ruled with a harsh but just hand. He privately began working on a new law that would make the lives of his slaves better, and eventually even free them all. He kept his plan secret, even from Zerath. He couldn't just let them all go in a day. Many of the great noble houses depended on enforced labor to ensure their wealth and power. That's why he was putting a plan together that would make it all work. Despite Azir's desire to name Zerath his brother, he couldn't do it until all Shurima's slaves were free. Through these years, Zerath protected Azir from his political rivals and guided the expansion of the empire. Azir married and fathered numerous children, some by wedlock, others by ill-advised relations with slaves and harem girls. Zerath stoked the emperor's grand vision of an empire greater than any the world had ever known. But to stand as a ruler over the entire world, Zerath convinced Azir that he would need to be all but invincible, a god amongst men, an ascended being. Soon, Azir announced that he would undertake the ascension ritual, that the time was right for him to take his place alongside Nasus and Renekton. Many questioned his decision. The ascension ritual was highly dangerous and intended only for those near the end of their lives, those who devoted their lives to Shurima and whose service was to be honored with ascension. It was for the Sun Priests to decree who would be blessed with ascension, not the Emperor himself. But Azir's arrogance grew along with his new empire, and so those who disagreed were punished by death. The day of the ritual finally came, and Azir marched towards the dais of ascension, surrounded by thousands of his warriors and tens of thousands of Shurima's citizens. The brothers Renekton and Nasus were absent. Zerath called for their help to deal with an emergent threat, but still, Azir would not turn from what he saw as his great destiny. Azir climbed to the great golden disc, and in the moments before the Sun Priest began the ritual, he turned to Zerath and finally freed him. And not just him, but all slaves. Zerath was stunned into speechlessness, but Azir was not done yet. He embraced Zerath and named him his eternal brother, as he promised he would all those years ago. Azir turned as the priests began the ritual to bring down the awesome power of the sun. Azir was unaware that Zerath had studied more than just history and philosophy in his quest for knowledge. He had learned the dark arts of sorcery, all the while nursing a desire for freedom that had grown like a cancer into a burning hatred. At the height of the ritual, the former slave unleashed his powers and Azir was blasted from his place on the dice. Without the protection of the runic circle, Azir was consumed by the sun's fire as Xerath took his place. The light filled Xerath with power, and he roared as his mortal body was being transformed. But the magic of the ritual was not intended for Xerath, and such awesomely powerful celestial energies could not be diverted without dire consequences. The power of the Ascension ritual exploded outward, devastating Shurima and laying waste to the city. Its people burned to ash, and its towering palaces fell to ruin as the desert sands rose up to swallow the city. The sun disk sank from the sky, and what had taken centuries to build was brought to ruin in an instant by one man's ambition and another's misplaced hate. All that remained of Azir City were sunken ruins and echoes of its people's screams on the night winds. Azir saw none of this. His last memories were pain and fire. He knew nothing of what happened after he was stricken down. Thousands of years after Shurima's doom, he and his city got a second chance.
The tragic fall of Shurima was nothing compared to the tragedy of its rise from the grave. In a market on the edge of the desert, a stranger appears. Cassiopeia, a noble woman of Noxus, looking to hire a guide to take her to the fabled lost city. Venom sears her flesh like acid. As Sivir lies betrayed and bleeding, something incredible occurs. For though she does not know it, Sivir is the last in the bloodline of Azir, Shurima's lost emperor. And as her blood soaks into the ancient sands, a deep magic sparks to life. Resurrection. First Azir's mind, then his body, snatched back from oblivion to be reborn. Then he sees Sivir, wonders at her face. He sees himself in this daughter of Shurima. In that moment, he has no thought of empires or rituals. He only knows she needs his help. He must take her to the oasis of the dawn, the mother of life. He smells the waters, smells of life. He prays he's in time. He does not dream that he, Shurima's greatest emperor, can at long last earn his ascension and bring back his broken city. He dares not dream that if he can save her, Azir can save them all.
The resurrection of Sivir was an act of selflessness, and for that, the Sun Disk itself gave Azir the ultimate reward, Ascension. Azir emerged from the tombs beneath the sand and witnessed that nothing remained the same. He was used to having 10,000 elite warriors marching behind him, but now he was alone. Even the stars and constellations were misaligned, since after all, millennia had passed. The daughter of Shurima who awakened him, she who bore his lineage, was gone. He sensed her out in the desert. As Azir walked through the city, images of his former citizens made out of sand appeared to show him the past. He saw echoes of his people pointing at the Sun Disk, their joyful expressions turning to horror. Mouths opened wide in silent screams. They turned to run, stumbling and falling. Azir watched this all in despairing silence, bearing witness to the last moments of his people. He still didn't know what happened, and he knew the answer was on top of the temple. Azir's focus narrowed. His march became more resolute. He reached the base of the Stairs of Ascension and began to climb, taking them 5 at a time. Sand versions of his royal servants and bloodline members lined his path. They too were swept away by the wind after moments of silence. He ran, taking the steps faster than any man could, talons digging into the stonework. Sand figures rose and were then destroyed to either side of him as he climbed. He reached the top. Here, he saw the final circle of onlookers. His closest aides, his advisors, the High Priest, his family. Azir dropped to his knees. His family was before him, rendered in perfect heartbreaking detail. His wife, heavy with a child. His shy daughter, clutching his wife's hand. His son, standing tall on the brink of becoming a man. In horror, Azir saw their expressions change. Though he knew what was to come, he could not look away. His daughter hid her face in the folds of his wife's dress. His son reached for his sword, shouting in defiance. His wife, her eyes widened, sorrow and despair breathed within. The unseen event blasted them to nothingness. With a heavy heart, he pushed himself to his feet. The question still remained. How did his bloodline survive? But the final echo still awaited. He saw himself in his mortal form rise up into the air beneath the Sun Disk, arms wide and back arched. He remembered this moment. The power coursed through him, infusing his being, filling him with its divine strength. Then he saw himself shatter like a glass as the echo of Xerath appeared. He watched as Xerath took his place and claimed the powers of the Sun Disk. The royal guards rushed to stop him, but they were too late. A brutal shockwave of sand flared out, disintegrating the final moment of Shurima. This is what killed his people. Azir was able to sense the magical essence in the air. He knew that Xerath is alive somewhere out there. He lifted a hand and an army of his elite warriors rose from the sand at the base of the Stairs of Ascension. Xerath, he said, his voice synced with rage. Your crimes will not go unpunished. And that is where Azir's half of the story ends. If you want to see the story from Xerath's point of view, tune in next time for another lore video.